Welcome back, my friends, to this new episode of our discussions on Indian modern fiction in English translations. And in continuity of our exploration of Ismet Chughai's Lihaf, translated into English as The Killed by Professor Asaduddin, we will begin today by trying to look at how the move from Urdu to English seem to have had created an indelible impact on the afterlife of the story Lihaf. Of course, a lot of the literature that we read in our school, colleges, and universities are mediated out of the act of translation. As a student of English literature, we begin with the Greek classics, often not in original Greek and Latin, but in English abridged formats. And this tradition runs through transcontinental literatures being picked up one after the other: French, German, Russian, Latin American, South Asian, so on and so forth. This is to try and make us realize that translation becomes the very core of our literary understanding, and more so in a multi-plural and multicultural nation like India, where even to think is to translate. In doing so, if now we would try and make ourselves think of how translation may have affected the tone of the Urdu story Lihaf in very specific ways when compared to the English form where it's called The Killed, I believe it might be helpful to see Chughai's use of Urdu in Lihaf trying to accomplish at least three very significant functions. One is to camouflage, given the very topic of the story is so contemporary and critical to the needs and desires of the time. Chughai had to say what she did say through her words, but what was more important is how she would express herself. So, Urdu, or Chughai's use of Urdu, if I may say, did enable her to camouflage her thoughts, her concepts in a language which she deemed to be appropriate. If camouflage was the first criteria that Chughai had in mind, I believe the next and equally important would be the need to provoke. Chughai's Lihaf is an elementary act of provocation. And if there could have been any better need to have it established as a modern piece of fiction, then how Lihaf qualifies as an act of provocation should be one of the reasons that would be taken up first and foremost. And to top it all, let us also not forget about the mellifluous rhythm of the Urdu Zuban, which tends to chime very well with the Lucknowi elite setting in which Chughai places her characters and analyzes their dealings. When Urdu migrates into English, each of these changes tend to be appropriated to a certain degree. We could try and lay out a concise note of how it may have had worked, but given that understanding is an act of personal exploration, the best would still be to try and read the Urdu Lihaf and the English Kilt in a comparative understanding. Chughai's Urdu, if you tend to read Lihaf in its original, is very mischievous, almost teasing to an extent. It is full of idioms and it has the sharpness of any colloquial tongue of the land. The idioms that Chughai tends to very wittily collect and bring within the folds of the written narrative are especially those spoken by women, to which effect the Urdu version also tends to be an archive of oral history of Muslim women from Chughai's life. But the intention behind trying to bring these anecdotal idioms into the fold of the literary narrative is to try and introduce their sarcasm, their humor into the treatment of the story. Which is how Chughai's story is not only about the women but also told in a language which is categorically and primarily spoken by the women. For instance, when you read Lihaf, there is this constant, reference by Rabbu to raw mangoes, kache aam in Urdu, which sounds so earthly, when you tend to put it in the context of the Urdu culture. But raw mangoes in English becomes almost a literal meaning of the same, and it loses that domestic sting of the female gossip culture. Kache aam in Urdu would be playfully nasty. Raw mangoes in English is rather mild in carrying over that sarcasm. What happens then is the story, which tends to border itself in the erotic ambiguity of the female desire, becomes more literal in its English transcreation and more elusive in the Urdu original. Words like khujli for itch, malish for massage, garmi for body heat all have double meaning in the source language. And translation into English almost forces them to have a very flat semantic precision, making the erotic code look more and more direct than what Chughai might have had intended to. This change in the effect on tone is a direct implication that translation tends to bring forth with it. It also changes the class accent of the languages used. Chughai's Urdu register is very region specific. The Lucknow elite class standards that seems to be delineated through the words spoken by the characters in Urdu speaks of sophistication. The Begum, though speaks in diction, has a polished and courtly language to use. The domestic maids, rather, speak in a more rougher and provincial speech. This difference in language, which cut across class, which cut across gender, flatten off in English, where it appears that all characters have the same register of narration. The linguistic economy of feudal Lucknow, the difference between the speech of Tehzeeb and the speech of the Bazaar, thins out in the English translation. However, the vocabulary of the sensuous words, the Urdu words like attar, like rogan, like raat ki sardi. Uh, there are English equivalents such as, oil, perfume, cold night, which tends to give you a roundabout understanding of what might have been the evocation in the original text. But you see, most of the English assumptions are merely descriptive in the way they tend to make you understand the storyline. One of the biggest impacts that the translation is being able to wrought over from moving away to English is by turning the humor in the Urdu language into what appears to be irony in English. So, whenever we have Begum Jan speaking with Rabbo in the original version of Lihaf, it seems that there is some conspiration going on, which is a conspirational humor actually, right? But in English, and that I believe it comes from the nature of the language that English is, even such witty repartees are conducted in a very controlled irony of manner, right? Chuktai's humor, because perhaps it's inspired from the oral speech, is very quick, naughty, mischievous. But English tends to make it appear more polished, more literary, more ironic. It does not only happens with phrases that speak of desire, but it also happens with phrases which speaks about spiritual ideas. For instance, when the narrator is asked to recite the Ayatul Kursi, the Urdu reader registers it with, ideas that are associated with the fear of the jinn, the spiritual ghost, with superstitions which are still operative in the stage of childhood, or as a function which is associated with the daily act of household religiosity. In English, the recitation is nothing but a cultural footnote, right? And it hardly tends to grow up into an emotional reflex. Because this story is also about sexual suppression, I believe the Urdu version tends to work a lot on the unsaid meaning of the words. There is larger scope to read silences in the narrative when you read Lihaf. But the exposure and the naming of emotions in the kilt does not has that element of hush which is there in the Urdu. Okay, the English version almost seems to lose on the music of the domestic speech. The rhythmic domestic Urdu words that the text of Lihaf is filled with at every nook and corner. Are larki, hai Allah, pagli, and similar words which switch between endearment and scolding when Begum Jan and Rabbu is together, or both of them are with the young narrator, almost becomes a very unilateral statement in the English translation. This indirectness of the Urdu language does not judge, it expresses itself. However, the English implication is always to interpret the Urdu. And in doing so, I believe the idea of censorship, the idea with which I had tried to connect the central notions of camouflage and provocation, entirely depends on Chuktai's use of metaphor and innuendo in Lihav, this strategy weakens to a large extent in the English translation for sure. Whereas the Urdu reads like a coded rebellion, the English is an open act of transgression. So the mischief of Urdu is translated into literary irony in English. The class texture is flattened down. The oral humor becomes a literary sarcasm. But what stays powerful despite translation is the monstrosity of the killed, the suffocation of the Begum's desire, and the tragedy of the confined, female sexuality. And this political bite of Chughtai's narrative is what survives the structural cliche of the act of translation, I would like to think. And this analysis of the language of desire and the examples of specific Urdu words, mistranslated or untranslatable to be so, would be actually a very good point to try and refer to the afterlife of the story, as in to try and refer to the notorious act of the story being subjected to the obscenity trial in 1944. And the social climate, the courtroom dynamics, the ideological battles that tend to go hand in hand with the context of this political and cultural climate. What seems to be an universally acknowledged fact is that Chughtai herself always represented her as someone who belonged to the progressive writers movement. She took a lot of pride to equate herself with literary figures such as Sajjad Jahir, like Manto, like Krishan Chandar, and others. To the extent, if you look at Asaduddin, talking about Chughtai, in a piece called Alone on Slippery Terrain, Professor Asaduddin writes, she had a very special place among her illustrious contemporaries in the same sphere. Rajinder Singh Bedi, Kishan Chandar, and Sadat Hasan Manto. From the point of view of a historical perspective, Ismat may rightly be regarded as the spiritual descendant of the enfant terrible of the Angari group, that is Sajjad Haidar, Ahmed Ali, Rashid Jahan, and Mahmud Zafar. Now, given that this obscenity trial, which unfolded itself in the late colonial North India, there was these three overlapping anxieties which was shaping up the idea of literary censorship in pre-independence India. Of course, there was the British colonial moral policing, which we will talk about not only in regard to the specific historical occurrence of the obscenity trial, but also in trying to look at how the colonial powers, through their act of modernization, has always tried to disregard a part of our traditional history, which took us a long time to try and revive on our own accord. There was the transition that was happening in the Urdu literary culture, the progressive, writers movement, which was attacking long-standing institutions such as feudalism, religious hypocrisy, as well as sexual repression. And there was the explosion of, female authorship, where women were writing about their bodies, about their own desires, without caring about male literary authority, without caring about norms of respectability, and without caring about patriarchal decorum. Now, why Lihav was considered obscene? Of course, officially, if you look into what the court documents has to talk about, and you also read what Chugtai has to write in her Kagazi Hai Perehan, a piece of non-fiction which has been very, very meticulously translated into English by another reputed Chugtai scholar, Professor Tahira Naqvi, who has spent her entire life translating Chugtai into various languages for sure. You would see that the charge was of sexual obscenity, right? And unofficially, the story of Lihav was actually dealing with, if not more, at least 3 taboos. The idea of women desiring women's body, which was of course unspeakable in the public discourse. The critique of Islamic aristocracy, where you have the Nawab indulging in homoerotic exchanges, and as a consequence of it, the imprisonment of Begum Jan in the Killa, and female sexual agency without men, where Rabbu and Begum seems to try and attain a certain level of independence and excess where the male figure is almost absent or redundant, so as to say. Now, the trial itself was filed as a case in the Lahore High Court in 1944. And in the same trial, Sadat Hassan Manto was being tried for his short story called The Boo, the English equivalent for which would be Odor. The colonial court then demanded specifically questions, or I would rather say responses to questions that they had to ask repeatedly to Manto and Chugtai. Where is the obscenity in the story? Which word violates public decency? And where is the sexual act described? And if you read Manto's own writing on this trial, of that instance, when Ismat herself is writing on the Lihav trial, you will see that what steel these people are made out of. When Ismat tends to talk about the trial herself, she almost tends to make it appear as an act of grotesque humor. To the extent, if I could possibly try and read out a small portion from this collection translated by Professor Naqvi called My Friend, My Enemy, you will know why I tend to appreciate their stance to this. So, she writes, that was when Shahid and Mohsin both flared up. Not taking any of this seriously, I had been laughing all this time. So there has been a Thanedar who had come to her household while she was possibly feeding the hungry child of hers, and they had been welcomed by Ismat's husband and the other men in the family. Shahid and Mohsin made me very nervous. I thrusted the milk bottle towards the Inspector Sahib so that I could free my hand and sign the summons. But he shrank back as if he had pointed the muzzle of a gun at him. Mohsin quickly took the bottle from me and I finally signed the paper. Please come to the station for your bail, Inspector Sahib said. The bail is 500 rupees, to which Ismat speaks, I don't have 500 rupees at this time. Not you. Someone else will have to put up the bail for you. I don't want anyone else to get involved, you see. If I don't go to the bail, you can arrest me. And this time, the Inspector Sahib didn't lose his cool. He smiled, and glancing at Sahib, he said, please come along. It will not take too long. But what about the bail? I said, softening a bit. Mohsin said, I will put up the bail. But my daughter is hungry, Inspector Sahib. Her ayah is new, and she is only a young girl. You may feed your daughter first, Inspector Sahib said. Well, in that case, please come inside. Mohsin brought the Inspector Sahib home. And after signing all the forms, Ismat asked, where do you keep your prisoners, Inspector Sahib? Inspector says, you want to see them? Ismat says, absolutely. I was taken to see a few men lying crisscross in a cramped space behind bars. These are not prisoners. They are criminals. They will be presented in the court tomorrow, Inspector Sahib explained. And what is their crime? Well, brawling, rioting, pickpocketing. And what will be their punishment? Fines or maybe a few days in jail? And then Ismat has the guts to ask, where would you have kept me, Daroga? Oh, there's no arrangement for women here. We take women up to Grant Road or Mitangale. And you see, in this brave confrontation also, as much as in the memorable piece of her autobiography, which she calls Kagazi Hai Perihan, where she deals entirely with this trial, and there is, a very, very large episode that it tends to give to the trial, she seems to own this act as something that does not necessarily puts her into trouble, but empowers her and enables her to come into direct confrontation of the state and the law designed by it. It is interesting that when these questions are took up in the court, ironically, the court, realizing that the story might have had turned to be obscene into the reader's mind, was nothing but a flight of imagination. And this statement in itself seemed to offer Chugtai a feminist triumph. She was able to allow the male readers sexualize their shadows. She was able to shout out to her readers that the law had no grammar which could define one woman's desire for the other. And the story's so-called obscenity, therefore, existed beyond evidence, which is why the court could not convict her and she was acquitted. Of course, the not-so-progressive authors of Chugtai's times attacked her on the grounds of being shameless, on being dishonoring the women of her time, and almost importing Western depravity. But these were the same people whose fiction were full of courtesans, prostitutes, and female desires. These were the people whose desire were permissible to appear in print. The obscenity trial, of course, strengthened Chugtai's solidarity with the progressive writers' movement. They did not only defended her right to realism, but the trial also, I believe, exposed that how censorship is not only about literary imagination, but as always, it is used as a tool of class and gender repression. Of course, Chuktai's personal strategy was also very, very brave in this regard. She refused to provide any apology, any withdrawal, or any moral remorse in this case. It is this attitude which transformed her into an icon, a sort of an, literary outlaw, if I could use that word for sure. But also let us not be ignorant of the legal significance of this condition. The fact that she was acquitted was established on the idea that suggestion cannot function as not obscenity. Metaphor cannot be read as pornography, and desire of any sort cannot be policed through evidence. I believe one of the cultural consequences of the 1944 obscenity trial, therefore, went on to celebrate Le Havre as a classic, as a feminist text, and as a landmark. And the trial mattered because in the history of South Asia, this is a public event where maybe for the umpteenth time, the idea of homoerotic desire is entering into our legal vocabulary, and a woman is telling the nation that you don't get to decide what women think and write about. We get to know more of Chuktai in our last session next.